right, so hello everyone and welcome to the Europlanet webinar of September 2018. This is part of the monthly webinar series organized by Nucleo for Europlanet on planetary sciences. My name is Nuno Gomes and I'm an astronomer working at Nucleo in Portugal. I'm talking from the beautiful city of Porto in the north of Portugal, and I will be your host today. Joining me is Kevin Bonine. Kevin is the Director of Education and Outreach of the Biosphere project and the Director of Outreach Initiatives at the College of Science of the University of Arizona. Hello, Kevin.
Good morning.
How are you? Good morning. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. It's an honor to having you with us today. And thank you especially because it's so early there in the United States.
My pleasure. Yes, we're in southern Arizona, and I have been to Porto many years ago. It is a beautiful city on the coast.
Yeah, it is indeed. And if you have been here for many years, so you should come back because the city has changed a lot during the last 10 years. So I'm sure you have plenty of new things to visit as well and to enjoy.
Sounds great.
Cool. Kevin is going to talk about the Biosphere 2 experimental facility, which is, I suppose, the world's largest controlled Earth science research facility. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
Okay, and which has helped us better understand our planet and how we might be able to live on other worlds. I'm going to give you the word the word quite soon. I just wanted to remark that at the end of your presentation, we are going to have a Q&A session. So if you that are joining us have any questions you would like to ask during the presentation, please use the chat window available at the Zoom software to write down your questions, okay? So I think we are ready to start. Kevin, you have the word.
Okay, thank you very much. And I do have some slides and a PowerPoint that I'm going to go through. And then we have another camera set up so that I can show everyone a couple of the spaces inside that Biosphere 2. And we can show those spaces and I can take questions and answer questions at the same time. So looking forward to it. Can everyone see my slide screen?
I think so, yes.
You did? Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you very much to Europlanet and Nucleo for the invitation to talk with folks about Biosphere 2 and the work that we do here. I've been fortunate to partner with some of the European colleagues that helped me connect with Nucleo, Europlanet, Rosa Duran, and other folks. So thank you very much for setting all this up.
No, it's our pleasure.
Thank you, thank you. Biosphere 2 was built in the late 80s, early 1990s in southern Arizona, about an hour north of Tucson. And the focus was sort of twofold. One was to understand how planet Earth works. And two, if we understood it well enough, could we then recreate it someplace else in the solar system or the universe to support life and humans off of planet Earth? So the building you're looking at, again, built in the late 1980s. The University of Arizona has been involved for 10 years now. And prior to that, it was a private enterprise. And Columbia University did some work here for a few years as well. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that we do now, as well as some of the initial projects that were done back in the 1990s and 2000s. So we're kind of a special facility in the sense that we are the world's largest controlled Earth systems research facility, and that's our primary function, is to do research about how planet Earth works, how water moves, how energy moves, how carbon cycles, all those things that we need in order to produce the plants that produce the oxygen and the food that we need, etc. We also have about 100,000 visitors that come through every year. So it's a living research facility where we can teach people about the science that we do and how planet Earth works. Biosphere 2 was named Biosphere 2 because Earth is Biosphere 1, and Biosphere 2 is an attempt to mimic or recreate those processes that make life on planet Earth possible. And as far as we know, it's the only life like this in the solar system, or perhaps the universe. And you know, one of my colleagues said once, and I really love this idea, that whether we are the only life in the universe or there is lots of other life in the universe, the conclusion is astounding, right? Either way, it's just amazing. The other thing that we have, and thanks to Columbia University, is a set of dormitories or apartments so that we can house researchers and students and conferences and retreats at Biosphere 2. We're kind of off in the desert, away from the rest of the cities and towns in southern Arizona, and it's a beautiful place to think about science and be inspired. You may have seen, if you were paying attention the last couple of weeks, that the Drone Racing League had a race here at Biosphere 2 that aired for the first time in the US on Thursday of last week. And my understanding is that it airs around the world to 30 million viewers or so. And it was really a fun project for us to be a part of. They raced around the building, they raced inside the building. And if you get a chance to check out that footage, I encourage you to see that. And if you're into video games, they have a simulator where you can choose to fly any number of the courses that the Drone Racing League has used in the past. And soon Biosphere 2 will be a choice on this game, and you'll be able to fly through Biosphere 2. So this will be an introduction, and maybe in a couple of months you can fly through the facility on your own. So why was Biosphere 2 built? Well, back in the 60s and 70s, people were interested in understanding how the planet worked. There was more and more concern about pollution and degradation of ecosystems. And this Biosphere 1, planet Earth, had finally been seen from space. This blue marble iconic photo really got people thinking about perhaps the fragility of life in the solar system that may exist only on planet Earth. And if we could figure out a way to understand this and encapsulate it and seal it off, then maybe we would be able to fix the problems on planet Earth, or be able to recreate the conditions for sustained life off of Earth. There was also an attempt to test something called the Gaia hypothesis, was this notion that there were emergent properties that happened because of the life systems and life forces on the planet. And if we could recreate these things, maybe we could better understand some of the predictions of that Gaia hypothesis. So the big idea, as evidenced by that light bulb, is to try and recreate these systems in a closed space to better understand them and see if we could recreate them. There were folks like this gentleman, Claire Folsom, who did some work with closed systems at smaller scales. And if you put the right nutrients and bacteria and other things inside of these, you could seal them off. And just so long as you had an input of energy, you could keep these things going indefinitely. And some of these sealed ecospheres are still functioning. A famous author, Rachel Carson, also warned us about the threats to our planet of some of the human-created compounds and chemicals that we were putting into the environment, things like pesticides. There were, sad cases of rivers catching fire because there were so many oil and gasoline pollutants in them. So people were concerned about the planet. They wanted to understand the planet. So in the 1980s, a group of folks got together with a funding benefactor and built this almost 2-hectare facility in the desert in southern Arizona. This is a picture of construction in the late 1980s. And it wasn't just about what was going on then, it was also a nod to the future. And some of the ideas and some of the concerns that you may have seen in the movie The Martian are the same kinds of concerns and issues that people were interested in learning more about in the 80s and 90s when Biosphere 2 was being built. And if you could recreate the systems that produce oxygen, clean water, and food, then maybe you could figure out how to do this somewhere else in the solar system. So I enjoy this movie, The Martian. There are lots of fun ideas in here. The fact that he's trying to basically terraform part climate of Mars in order to produce food? Those are some of the kinds of questions that we think about here. And I'll show you a little bit more of one of our big research facilities that has some nascent soil that can help us understand how we might be able to terraform somewhere else. Back in the 1990s, there were 8 folks that went inside Biosphere 2, this 2-hectare facility. And their goal was to stay inside for 2 years, produce their own food, produce and recycle oxygen, absorb enough carbon dioxide to not poison the atmosphere, and to produce enough food. This is the half-acre or approximately quarter-hectare farm facility inside Biosphere 2. We do different things with this space right now, but you can see that they were trying to grow a number of different crops in the 1990s. And they weren't just growing calories and nutrients, they were also growing oxygen. So the light coming through the glass would be used in photosynthesis by the plants to produce sugars, carbohydrates, and would produce oxygen and water while absorbing carbon dioxide, all important components of regulating the atmosphere inside this closed facility. Inside we have savanna biomes, a desert, we have a tropical rainforest, inside one of the larger pyramids that you'll see when you look at pictures of the facility. There's a 700,000 gallon ocean that is close to 9 meters deep at its deepest point. And in order to support the people and the biomes inside, there was a lot of work done to regulate movement of air and temperature and water around the facility. If you look underneath this building, there's about a hectare or a little more than a hectare of infrastructure underneath that provides the support to make those biomes and plant growth areas possible up above. So about 2/3 of the size of the structure above is a bunch of pipes and wires and tanks and pumps and air handlers and heat exchangers. All of these things we call the technosphere are a large investment in mechanical infrastructure, engineering design, all these things needed to recreate what happens basically for free on planet Earth. So this gets us to the idea of something called ecosystem services. Sometimes this is called nature services. What are these things that happen on Earth that we value that perhaps we don't always pay for, but provide value to us? So this picture here is somebody hand pollinating a flower. If you didn't have insects or birds and bats going around and pollinating flowers and producing the next generation of plants, you'd have to spend a lot of time and energy trying to move pollen from one flower to another. And if you think about what your food would cost, if you had to pay people to do all the pollination of the food crops, it would get very, very expensive very quickly. There's lots of other examples of ecosystem services, things like clean water, oxygen production, recreation, and artistic inspiration. Here's a picture not of a person pollinating a flower, but of a bee, and there are many, many thousands of species of bees and other pollinators that help maintain and regulate ecosystems that produce the food, water, and the food energy that we need in order to enjoy the lifestyles that we have. So this is a concept I wanted to introduce so that when we think about trying to recreate Earth's functions and Earth systems, we have to realize that it takes quite a bit of investment in order to make those things happen. In fact, the cost of building Biosphere 2 back in the late 80s and early 90s was close to $200 million. And if we were to recreate this building and infrastructure today, it would probably cost us about $1 billion. So the University of Arizona is very thankful to have a very expensive research tool at our disposal. There aren't people living inside anymore, but we get to do a lot of really neat research. one of the things that happened during the first year that there were 8 people inside was an El Nino event. This is a weather phenomenon that we pay attention to in the Americas. So if you look over here, you can see that there's increased precipitation during El Nino years. And what happens is that the wind that blows across the Pacific Ocean, instead of blowing from east to west, it basically stops, and a whole lot of warm water sits off the coast of the Americas. And that warm water produces enough energy and evaporation to increase the creation of clouds and more storms, more rainfall, more cloud cover. And if you are trying to rely on sun coming through your large greenhouse building in order to grow your food and produce your oxygen, you're going to have a hard time in years where there's less than average sunlight. So one of the challenges, and this is one of the 8 folks inside, he was the oldest at the time. He was a physician, a doctor, Roy Wolford. And these 8 folks worked very hard trying to grow enough food and produce enough oxygen and capture carbon dioxide, but they all lost a lot of weight because they couldn't grow enough calories fast enough. There just wasn't enough biomass production going on inside the facility for these folks to maintain their body mass. They had plenty of nutrients, but they just didn't have enough calories. Another thing that happened was the oxygen concentration inside the facility changed. It went down. Normally, oxygen concentration in the atmosphere is about 21%. And after about a year and a half or a year and 3 months, the oxygen concentration was down closer to 14%. So they weren't able, with the plants that they had inside, to produce enough oxygen in order to keep pace with the production of carbon dioxide that was happening inside the facility. Now you'll see that it went back up right here. This is when oxygen was pumped into the facility so that they could continue the 2-year planned mission and see if they could survive. But they did have to bring in some outside oxygen. Now, in order to grow all these plants inside, they knew when they were building it that the glass was going to change the light that came through the building. It was going to change the wavelengths that came through. They were worried that the plants would not have the light that they needed, and so they didn't want the plants to be nutrient limited. So when they put in soil in the facility, they pulled some soil from what are called cattle tanks. And in the southwest US and northern Mexico, cattle tanks are places where water is harvested off the landscape, and cows come and drink because there's not a lot of other water sources. And when they come and drink, they also stand around and they defecate. And so there are lots and lots of nutrients and microbes and bacteria in these spaces. And this was some of the soil that was put inside Biosphere 2 so that there'd be plenty of nutrients for the plants. But there were so many nutrients for the microbes in the soil that the microbes were extremely happy. And they were just reproducing and growing like crazy. They absorbed oxygen out of the atmosphere. They produced carbon dioxide. And something that took several months for the folks inside to figure out was that the carbon dioxide was getting absorbed into the concrete of the components of the structure that was still curing. The concrete hadn't been left to set, it hadn't been sealed, and carbon dioxide was going into the concrete as it was aging. And that pulled a chunk of the atmosphere basically out of the air. So the oxygen went from the air into the soil microbes, came out as carbon dioxide, and then that carbon dioxide got sequestered into the concrete. So to depict this a little bit more graphically, if you add all of these soil microbes and the oxygen they were consuming, plus this concrete that was absorbing carbon dioxide, you ended up with this situation where oxygen levels were dropping, and it made it hard for the 8 people inside to survive and thrive. They were already working very hard to try and grow enough food and to maintain all of the pumps and equipment and collect scientific data. And that was made even harder by the 14% oxygen concentration that made it feel like they were doing all this halfway up the side of the mountain. Now, this quickly gets one thinking about analogs outside of Biosphere 2, on Biosphere 1, Earth, we know that because of the Industrial Revolution, carbon dioxide concentrations are increasing in the atmosphere. And they oscillate every year because there's more land cover and plants in the Northern Hemisphere. During the growing season in the Northern Hemisphere, more carbon dioxide is absorbed than in the winter in the Northern Hemisphere. But this graph obviously goes up. These are data from Hawaii. And it's because over hundreds of millions of years, fossil fuels were being deposited into the earth from plants dying, dinosaurs dying, all sorts of biological matter decomposing and being turned into fossil fuels. And we now have the technology to bring out, over the course of a couple hundred years, what took several 100 million years to deposit. So we've changed the balance of carbon and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Because we have this large-scale 2-hectare controlled research facility, there were some logical questions to ask about the impacts of elevated carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. One of them was with the ocean, and as carbon dioxide concentrations increase in the air, more of it gets absorbed into the water and turned into carbonic acid, and that acidity can compromise the growth of organisms that live in the ocean. The other experiment that Columbia University spent a fair bit of time on was growing trees, all of the same variety, in the space where the 8 people were growing their food, and they manipulated temperature and precipitation as well as carbon dioxide concentrations and looked at the responses of these trees. The idea being that if we could manipulate the atmosphere and the conditions such that we could make them inside Biosphere 2, what we thought it might look like in 2030 on planet Earth, we could get an idea of what we were in for. We could make some predictions about what might happen in the future. The conclusion, which has now been borne out in the ocean, along with increases in temperature being a challenge for living organisms in the ocean like corals, was that if you make it more acidic in the water, then the rate of creation of the hard parts of organisms like corals, the calcification rate, went down. And that caused the corals to suffer. And in fact, this experiment took these corals to death inside our Biosphere 2 ocean. And that's one of the areas that we're looking to recreate in the future, near future, experiments looking at coral health and which coral species might survive higher temperatures and higher CO2 concentrations in the future in our oceans around the world. Coral reefs are one of the varieties of organisms in big trouble. Okay. One of the things that we have in our heads at Biosphere 2 is that this facility is for Earth system science what the Large Hadron Collider in Europe is for physics, and what large, expensive telescopes are for astronomy. We spend many billions of dollars studying these things with these very sophisticated instruments, and Biosphere 2 is a large, expensive tool for studying how planet Earth works. What are some of those big challenges in Earth system science? Well, understanding how things change over different scales, across space or across time. And how do the physical and living worlds interact? What is the physical, chemical, and biological intersection that makes life possible on our planet? And how is that affected by things like a changing climate? We know that temperature and precipitation patterns are changing around the world. Predictions are for even more changes as the years go on. And so Biosphere 2 is a place where at large scale, we can understand some of these interactions amongst living systems, and not just individual species, but whole communities. Understand how these systems are going to be impacted by temperature changes and by precipitation changes. So what Biosphere 2 offers is the ability to connect observations out on the landscape in Biosphere 1, where you can't control all the variables, to laboratory scale experiments where you have lots of control, but you have small scale, where you may not see the emergent properties of the interactions that happen amongst communities or that happen at larger scales. So how do you find that intersection and connect what you're seeing via experiments in the lab with what you're observing out in the natural world? Biosphere 2 provides a scale and a space for doing just those sorts of experiments. The key drivers of changes in climate and vegetation communities and everything else that we value in ecosystems are water and temperature. And so if we look at water, right, we've all learned the water cycle, but we actually don't understand all the details about what's going on in the soil, how plants are interacting, how long the water stays in the soil, what happens if temperature increases, is there going to be water available for humans, especially in arid environments like southern Arizona or plenty of other places on planet Earth? And also, what are the water resources available for ecosystems, for plant communities, for animals that we enjoy and treasure and are a valuable part of the biodiversity of planet Earth? We know that temperature increase projections vary, and a lot of it has to do with how much are we going to be able to curb carbon dioxide emissions in the future. So far, we haven't done a very good job as a human species of slowing our carbon dioxide emissions. So again, Biosphere 2 is a place where we can do experiments at a large scale to understand how planet Earth works. And these are the kinds of things that are important to all of us, right? Food, water, energy, those are things that we all care about and are important for us and our family and friends. So some of the other things that we do here are trying to educate the public and students about how to understand and perhaps help care for the planet in the future. We have lots and lots of students that come, about 10,000 students every year. We have lots of different lessons that we offer to help people understand the different components of the ecosystems inside Biosphere 2, and therefore understand how these spaces function in Biosphere 1, also giving folks the tools and the understanding to be able to make a difference in their own community and in their own region. One of the spaces that we've invested a fair bit of time and energy over the years is trying to train teachers to be better science teachers. So I want to thank all the teachers and classes that are part of this webinar today. Thank you for the work that you do. We all need to do a better job of understanding how the planet works and using science as a way to learn how these things work and be able to project what's going to happen in the future and how we might be able to control for it. We also have recently created a massive open online course. So for a group of folks that enjoys webinars, you may also enjoy this Coursera Science for the Future of Our Planet MOOC. It's got 9 modules with experts from different disciplines at the University of Arizona. So I encourage you to check out this free online course that will teach you even more about Biosphere 2 and the different systems and questions that Biosphere 2 addresses. So the next couple of slides, what I want to do is introduce to you a couple of the areas inside Biosphere 2, because I'm going to show you those via a different camera feed in just a few minutes. This facility that we call the Landscape Evolution Observatory contains 3 very large hill slopes. Each of those slopes that you see on the screen is 11 meters wide by 30 meters long with a meter deep crushed volcanic soil. And in this cartoon version, there are plants growing on a couple of the slopes. We have not yet added plants to the system because our science team is still very, very excited about what we're learning about the physics of water moving through this crushed volcanic soil, as well as the changes in the microbial community that happen every time you add water to the system. So much as we expected and suspected, water is the controlling variable for how life functions on planet Earth. When you add water to dry ecosystems, all sorts of things tend to become much more vibrant and be able to reproduce, and then maybe they go dormant for a while without water. Each of these slopes has 1,800 sensors buried inside of it so that we can measure in very great detail where the water is going, how it flows, how water stays in the system. We're also studying things like carbon sequestration. So crushed volcanic rock actually is a very good absorber of carbon and can help pull carbon and carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. But some estimates suggest that it would take more fossil fuels in order to break up the volcanic rock into soil to absorb the carbon than you'd be able to get carbon out of the atmosphere. You would put more in, making that soil available than you'd be able to pull out. So this is one of the facilities that I'm going to show you via a different camera in just a minute. This is another view from the top. Again, large scale, but with the control of a laboratory. There are things that we have learned by putting artificial rain on these hill slopes that we didn't know before. The estimates and predictions for how water moved through soil came from pouring water through a soil column on a lab bench, you know, maybe a meter, maybe 2 meters. And now at 30 meters, it's a much different story. Things are moving and changing, and it's much more complicated, but much more interesting. We can also add labeled water, so deuterium, and we can see the rate at which the water moves through the system or stays in the system. And these are fundamental details that we need in order to understand how environments are going to change as climate changes and temperature and precipitation changes. The other space I'm going to show you is a plant food growth chamber. We call it the Mars Lunar Greenhouse. And this is in partnership with the University of Arizona Controlled Environment Agriculture Center. This unit, or one like it, has been used to provide food for folks in Antarctica, especially in the winter. And so you use artificial light, you regulate temperature, and you provide water using a hydroponic system. So the roots are in water. And these are the kinds of systems that we're going to need to perfect, these bioregenerative life support systems. Bioregeneration, meaning that the plants are able to sustain themselves and produce the oxygen and nutrients that humans might need. A unit this size might be able to provide half the calories and the clean water and oxygen for one person if it was in top working order. So let me take a second now to switch cameras. So bear with me for a second, and we will switch over to a different camera. I'll show you the Landscape Evolution Observatory. I will show you the Mars Lunar Greenhouse, and with help of my partner Katie, we'll take some of your questions and answer those as well. Am I live? All right, so I think you can see me now. Katie's turning the audio down on my computer.
Okay, Kevin, we can see you and listen to you.
Are we good?
Yes, you can go.
Right. If you can't hear me, let me know, but I think the microphone is working. So I'm standing in front of one of the 3 landscape evolution research hill slopes. So this is crushed volcanic rock from up near Flagstaff, Arizona, northern Arizona. Each of these slopes has 1,800 sensors buried inside. We can use a sprinkler system to provide artificial rain, and then we can measure how the water is moving through the system or staying in the system, how the microbial community changes. And this is a partnership with physicists, atmospheric scientists, soil scientists, geomorphologists, all sorts of folks. You can also see that there are atmospheric sensors up above the slopes because we want to understand the full cycle. How does the soil and the air interact? So we can measure wind speed, we can measure carbon dioxide and oxygen concentrations in the atmosphere, we can measure humidity. And with these slopes, we are able to understand, by manipulating temperature and precipitation patterns, how water moving through soil may change on planet Earth in the future. Now, one of the things we hope to do in a few years is add plants to these slopes and then do experiments that look at the interaction of the soil, the plants, and the atmosphere. The challenge right now is that we're still learning a lot without the plants. And once you add the plants, you not only interrupt the physics because of the roots in the soil, but you also introduce a whole different microbial community into the soil as well. So Katie, do you have any questions there that you want me to, is there any in the chat? Okay, why don't you pull up two of the questions that we got earlier and I'll answer those right now.
Okay, this is from Luis in Portugal. What are the most successful species in Biosphere 2 and why?
Okay, Luis from Portugal asked, what are the most successful species inside Biosphere 2? And that's a great question. And it turns out that it's probably cockroaches at the moment that are the most successful species. There were some cockroaches that were introduced intentionally back in the early 1990s, but there were a number of species that came in voluntarily. The same way that we move pest species around the world when we transport things on ships and in airplanes, cockroaches were able to make it inside. And because there isn't other higher order species, there aren't things in here that eat cockroaches. The cockroaches are sort of the top of the food chain. And if they weren't here, you'd have a whole bunch of detritus and leftover plant matter that would build up. And so the cockroaches serve a very important function here. But I would say that's the most successful species. Second most successful is probably ants. And again, ants were introduced intentionally, but there are also some species that came in as volunteers. And between those two, they provide important functions inside Biosphere 2. Sometimes people think those are a little bit gross, but once you start looking at their adaptations and the services they provide, they're really, really neat species. How about another one?
We've got one from Kanol in Azerbaijan. Looking at the current rate of changing climate and environment, how can we save our planet?
Okay, Kanol from Azerbaijan wants to know about how we save the planet. This is a very complicated question, obviously. And as an ecologist, as a biologist, I don't know that I have the answer unless we're able to bring in people from around the world and politicians and decision makers. We have these international meetings with world leaders, and it really is going to take a globally concerted effort to figure out how to manage carbon dioxide emissions into the environment. That really is changing our climate, changing temperatures, changing precipitation patterns. Ecosystems suffer, people suffer, and it tends to be the folks with the fewest resources, the least amount of money that are going to suffer the most. So we need to figure out how to be more equitable in our treatment of the impacts of climate change. And I'll introduce a concept here called externalities. And so there are costs to doing things like using gasoline that are not paid at the pump, right? These are the things like increased asthma levels or changes in precipitation or temperature that devastate crops and agricultural fields. And you don't pay for those at the pump, but somebody's paying for those. If we could encapsulate all those costs, then we would learn that renewables and reducing our energy consumption would be a lot more palatable. It would be a choice that we would all want to make because we would understand the cost of the way that we're sort of adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere with fossil fuels today. Should we do one more?
Maria from Portugal wants to know what is the biggest challenge of this project?
What is the biggest challenge of this project? Maria from Portugal, thank you for that question. So I think it depends on which part of the project you're looking at, right? So the University of Arizona has been here 10, 11 years now. And I would say our biggest challenge is getting scientists from different disciplines to play nicely together. Sometimes that's not the easiest thing to do. I say that kind of in jest. They tend to do a great job of coming up with these project ideas. The other one is funding resources, right? It's expensive to do these projects and it's expensive to maintain this facility. So those are a couple of the challenges. I don't think we're we're not lacking good ideas as far as scientific questions to ask and try to answer. If you go back to Columbia University, they were doing great work, again, with climate change impacts, looking at the ocean, looking at the forest, looking at trees in this space behind me. This is where the crops were grown. When people were inside, this is where the trees were grown that Columbia manipulated with carbon dioxide, temperature, and precipitation. And now we're looking at the details of the soil, and then we'll add plants to the system later. If you go back further in time, when you had 8 people inside, I think the biggest challenges are that people don't always get along. And that's going to be one of the biggest challenges with long-term space exploration, is figuring out how to keep people from getting on each other's nerves. All right, we're going to transition to the Mars Lunar Greenhouse. We're probably going to cut out for a second because I need to switch the signal to the computer because we're moving to a different space. So I'll be with you in just a second. I'm going to carry this.
Okay, bear with us while Kevin is changing cameras. We will be back quite soon. We're still waiting for Kevin Bonine from the Biosphere 2 project experience in the United States. He's just changing camera, going to another place, but he will be online quite soon, I suppose.
Are we good? You can hear me? Are we reconnected? All right, excellent. So thank you for bearing with us as we switched connections to a different router. I'm standing in front of the Mars Lunar Greenhouse unit that we have here at Biosphere 2. And again, with colleagues at the University of Arizona, we're doing research on how to develop and maintain these bioregenerative life support systems. Space agencies and private individuals around the world are interested in figuring out how to grow food crops for folks that might live on the moon or live on Mars or live on some other moon in the solar system. Again, this would be to produce oxygen from photosynthesis. It would be to produce clean water by taking it through that plant life cycle. And obviously it produces nutrients and calories for folks that would be inside. So I'm going to take a walk inside and I'm going to show you some of the things that we're growing, and Katie's going to help zoom in on some of the food products that we've got in here. So I'm inside now, and you can see that there is a variety of different plant life in here. The National Space Agency in the United States would like to be able to grow about 20 different plant varieties in space to provide nutrients for folks. Each of these bags here is filled with water and a nutrient solution at an appropriate pH and salinity in order to grow these plants. We have peppers, we have cucumbers, and my favorite, strawberries. Can you see this strawberry here? This is a tasty one. I'm going to pick this one just to show you that
we can grow tasty, edible food in a closed environment like this. That was a sweet one, Katie. That was good. Now, the challenge with growing these things together is that the conditions for each individual plant are not exactly the same. So what you have to do is you have to find a compromise with the temperature, the nutrients, the pH, the salinity that works well for all the species, but none of them are actually producing maximally. You'd have to have a monoculture in order to do that. In addition to the oxygen and the clean water and the nutrients and calories, the other benefit is psychological, right? We like green spaces. We like light. And the folks in Antarctica on the South Pole, during the winter, they would barter and trade for the chore of going and working inside this facility because they got to be in light, they got to be by green plants, and we really like those things. One of the challenges in space is figuring out how to provide the right lights. And that's true for urban farming as well. How do you provide the right wavelengths in order to grow the food and not waste energy on light wavelengths that you don't need? All right, I'm going to come back out and then I'll answer some more questions. All right, I'm back. So what are a couple more of those questions, Katie? And then maybe we'll see if there's some that came in the chat as well.
Wilson from Columbia asks, would it be better if we turned all these vehicles electric?
So Wilson from Columbia asks, would it be better if we converted all the vehicles that we use into electric vehicles? That's an interesting question. If we could sort of magically get rid of all the existing fossil fuel vehicles on the road and all the new ones were electric, it probably would help make a difference. But if you think about all the resources and all the energy that goes into making a vehicle, we need to figure out how to actually consume less and reduce the resources that we use. So I think converting to electric makes sense. But when you see a car driving around that has a license plate that says 0 emissions, that's actually not true unless they are using solar panels on their house to charge that car. If they're using a coal-burning power plant to provide the electricity to charge their batteries, then clearly they're still producing emissions. I think, again, if we think holistically about what goes into the things that we use, the things that we consume, and this idea of externalities, that we want to make sure that the costs that we don't pay at the pump or when we pay for a car are included in our decision making, then we'll do a better job of making the right choices for the planet and for the people on the planet.
One from Berto in Nicaragua. Do you affect the growth and development of plants in gravity?
Humberto from Nicaragua asked about plants and nutrients in different gravities. Now this is something I don't know very much about. There have been lots of studies done on the space station, on various space shuttles and other space missions, looking at animals and plants in space and how gravity affects them. Now, one of the determinants of where roots go and where shoots go with the leaves is a response to gravity. So I haven't looked at the literature, but I would think that if you look into this, you're going to find that unless you produce some sort of gravity with like a centrifuge system in space, you're going to have a hard time getting the plants to grow in the right direction with the shoots up and the roots down.
Jeannie from Brazil, as teachers and students, what can we do to help Biosphere?
Jeannie from Brazil, as teachers and students, what can we do to help the biosphere? Is she talking 1 or 2?
Well, it doesn't say.
It says biosphere, okay. So biosphere 1, the Earth, I would say, think hard about the decisions that you make, that your friends make, that your family makes, and what resources are you using, and what are the impacts of those resources, right? So for example, if a store had to deal with the packaging and a worn out product when you were done with it, if you had to take, or if you could take the packaging and the product back to the store, and they would have to deal with it. They'd have to throw it away or recycle it or something like that. They would figure out how to use less packaging and perhaps products that would either last longer or that could be refurbished and sold again. If you're talking about Biosphere 2, I think that what you can do is continue to learn as much science as you can, but science in the context of humanities, right? How can we use science to better understand the planet, but also make choices and decisions that help people and the ecosystems that we rely on? So stay with your studies, get an education, and provide back to your communities. Provide some service, starting now, but throughout your career as well. We all could do a better job, especially those fortunate enough to be able to connect via webinar, right? There's lots of folks that don't have this opportunity. How can we help those folks in some way as well?
We have a question from Maria in the chat. What are the go-to plant species for foreign environments like Mars? Have you considered planting species that grow in some type of extreme environment, like top of the mountain Scandinavian flora, green herbs that grow on islands?
Great question. Who was that?
Maria.
Maria from?
She says greetings from Greece.
From Greece. Excellent. I was lucky enough to be in Greece for a little bit near Marathon in summer of 2017. Beautiful. As far as extreme plants, that's a great question. I think there's sort of been a push and pull in that conversation, right? There are some plants that can survive more extreme environments, but they may not provide some of the food resources that people are comfortable with or value. But there's also obviously opportunities to go with various kinds of algae, which can grow in lots and lots of different environments. And maybe you can use those for fuel, or you can use those for food. As far as the go-to species, I don't know that we know what those are yet. And I think there's still a lot of research to be done. And I think those are potentially some experiments for the teachers and the classes that are watching. Do a little bit of homework and then try and grow some of those things in your classroom and test them with different extreme conditions and see how they do. That would be a really neat contribution to our understanding.
One more question, Kevin, from Jeannie from Brazil. What can we do to make Biosphere classroom a factor of daily study using simple experiments that agitate curiosity?
All right, an excellent question from Brazil about how do you use this concept of closed systems, of biospheres, in order to stimulate student engagement and curiosity. There are a number of different biosphere kits that you can find online, and you can make these things. You can make those closed ecospheres with different things inside of them. Some people use fish or invertebrates in water along with some plants, and that closed system can actually last for quite a while. So I would look into that. We have some resources on our Biosphere 2 website as well, and those are great ideas. I encourage you to maybe not just hand your students a kit, but have them help understand and design what that kit needs to include and contain. They'll have more ownership, and they'll also get an understanding of what it takes because they'll have designed it themselves. All right, sounds like we're about ready to wrap it up. I'd like to thank you very much for spending your time with us today. This webinar will be available as a video on the Europlanet website in the near future. And please reach out to us at Biosphere 2 if you have any questions. And hope to see you sometime soon, either here or somewhere in Biosphere 1.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for this wonderful presentation. You gave us a lot to think about, especially in this time where we are very concerned about our planet, about the impact of pollution in our lives, and also in a time where we are thinking about revisiting new worlds such as the moon or visiting new ones such as Mars. So thank you again. It was a pleasure having you here today. As for you, what we does during this hour, thank you so much for attending and participating. Please follow Europlanet on Facebook and Twitter, and feel free to ask your planetary questions there. You can also watch this video and previous ones on the Europlanet YouTube channel. You can find more information about this webinar in the Europlanet webinars and Galileo Teacher Training Program web pages. And the links will be available in YouTube in the description section of this video. Hope to see you next time. Goodbye. Nuno out.